Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latin American Program and the Special Advisor to the Mexico Institute on Security. Ladies and gentlemen, you can take your seat up here. You don't have to sit up there quite yet. I'll call you up when it's time.
Just getting
Thank
the
you.
glasses.
Otherwise, you'll be sitting up there a long time before you start. All right, thank you very much for coming. There have been some travel difficulties. I know that you were looking forward to hearing Duncan Wood this morning, the director of the Mexico Institute. He was in Toronto visiting family, and his flight was canceled, so he shall be arriving mid-morning at some point. But I'm happy to fill in for him and to welcome you all to our 5th annual conference on security in Mexico, taking stock of the security landscape there. And we have 3 panels today, well, actually 2 panels and a keynote address that delve into some of the key issues related to security in Mexico, a look back at 2017, and a look ahead to what we can expect in 2018. I want to take just a moment to recognize a few people. I'm not sure everyone's here yet, but I wanted to recognize first, more than anything else, Major General Luis Rodriguez Bucio. He's the president of the Inter-American Defense Board, and the significance of this, I think, is that this is the first time Mexico has presided the Inter-American Defense Board, if I'm not mistaken. So congratulations to Mexico, and congratulations to General Rodriguez Bucio. I'd also like to recognize the agregado from CEMAR, the attaché, Vice Admiral Octavio Trejo Hermida. We've gotten a chance to talk with him on many occasions, and he was here with us at a panel with Rebecca Bill Chavez last year, so we're always delighted. Bienvenido, está en su casa. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. And I don't know if Brigadier General Andrés Fernando Aguirre Osunza is here, the attaché from Sedena. I don't see him yet, but he apparently will be here at some point, so we want to welcome him as well. Thank you all for being here. This has been a really interesting year. I'm talking here obviously about 2017, and there's a lot of anticipation for what will come in 2018. Let me just hit on a few key issues in the security agenda in Mexico from last year and going forward. Despite a very complicated political terrain, and let's be honest, NAFTA negotiations, talk of a wall, immigration policies, anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, the stray tweet here and there. The landscape has been a little complicated when it comes to security cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. But I think it's safe to say that the military-military relationship remains as strong as ever between both countries. And I think it's a testament to the seriousness and the professionalism of militaries in both countries. We have a paper that I want to call your attention to by Inigo Guevara, one of our regular consultants, that deals specifically with that relationship. It's called More Than Neighbors: New Developments in the Institutional Strengthening of Mexico's Armed Forces in the Context of U.S. Mexico Military Cooperation. That paper is available on the back. It'll be available online. And I think Inigo makes amply clear that the relationship between the militaries, despite all the other atmospherics, let's call it, is stronger than ever and growing quite well. A second development this past year was the passage of a long-debated and sometimes controversial internal security law, and that's been on the agenda in Mexico for many years. And if those of you aren't familiar with it, it's been a debate around the legal parameters and protections for the military as they engage in law enforcement and public security activities in Mexico. So that's been an important development. As I say, it's been controversial for some. We have developed our own little cheat sheet, if you will, called Mexico's Internal Security Law. If you haven't seen it yet, grab it from the back, and it lays out some of the arguments against it and some of the arguments in favor, and it's still something being hotly debated in Mexico. Third, there's been a dramatic increase in homicides, over 25,000 in Mexico last year in 2017. This is setting a record, the highest homicide rate in the country since official statistics were made available from government agencies. The question, of course, is why? Why is this happening? It had peaked out 22,000 more or less in 2011, then started a downward trend to 215, but why is it back up? And I think this is a very important question. It's causing many people to question the strategies and what is the best way to deal with homicides and violence in Mexico. And to that end, I want to point you to a little exercise we undertook called Why Are Homicides on the Rise Again in Mexico? What can be done about it? This will be posted. It's in the back on the back table. But really, it's the response of 4 terrific academics and practitioners who are engaged on a daily basis on questions related to crime and violence in Mexico. And they offer their ideas, their analysis of this deplorable trend in homicides in Mexico. So I really recommend you take a look at that as well. Fourth, the debate about rule of law and corruption in Mexico have become really a very salient issue. According to some polls, Mexicans are concerned about corruption is second only to their concern about the extreme violence as they head into the presidential elections. It has become a front and center issue for Mexicans, where as many as 14 present-day and former governors are under investigation. But it's also touched every level of government, the municipal level, obviously the state level with governors, but even the federal government, federal officials, and even at times questions and scandal around the presidency. So there's no question that this has become a relevant issue and a matter much debated in Mexico. How are we going to strengthen the rule of law in Mexico? How are Mexicans going to strengthen the rule of law? And what is the appropriate role for the state in that process? We have invited two very special components of our conference today. One, a keynote address by Mariclara Costa, a citizen member of the Council for the National Anti-Corruption System, Sistema Nacional Anticorrupción. She will be giving a keynote address after the first panel on this issue of corruption and what is it being attempted in Mexico to address the issues of corruption. And then our last panel, which is very important, I think, as well, brings together experts on the question of rule of law. We have published a new book that was overseen by Viridiana Rios here in the front row. We will be presenting that book, launching that book today. There are copies on the back. The book is titled The Missing Reform, Strengthening the Rule of Law in Mexico. And several contributors to this book are here with us today and will be talking about issues related to reform of the police, reform of the justice system, and efforts to prevent crime in Mexico. So we are really going to tackle this issue as well of corruption and rule of law in Mexico. So with all that, I am delighted to welcome you to our conference today. I am going to invite our first panelists, members of our first panel to come forward now and join me up here, and we will get started in just a minute. Thank you all for your attendance. For a moment there, I thought I left my notes on the printer. But anyway, thank you all for being with us. As I mentioned in the opening remarks, the question of the relationship between U.S. and Mexican militaries has been front and center for some time, and there is evidence that that relationship has actually been strengthening and become much more collaborative and open and over the last several years, frankly. And that, despite, as I say, some of the difficulty in the political terrain, we are glad to say that things remain on track. We have assembled a illustrious body, a panel of experts on the issue of military relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. Let me introduce each of them briefly, and then they will each make a presentation, and then we will have time for questions from the audience and dialogue between ourselves in just after that. We're going to start off with Dr. Craig Diehr. Craig has served on the faculty of the National Defense University since January 2001. Dr. Diehr came to the College of International Security Affairs in March of 2010 from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Study, where he served for 9 years as Professor of National Security Affairs and Dean of Academic Life. Most recently, he served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Conference. National Security Council. He has written a book, and I apologize, I forgot to write down the name, but he has written a book that came out recently, and he will be talking about that, right, in your presentation, that traces the history of the relationship between the two militaries. So thank you, Craig, for doing that. I'm going to introduce the other three speakers quickly, and then I'll turn it over to you. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez. She served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2013 to 2017. Prior to joining the Office of the Secretary of Defense and Policy, she was Professor of Political Science with tenure at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Her research has focused on Western Hemisphere security and on cooperative politics and comparative politics, with an emphasis on the rule of law, democratization, human rights, and Latin American politics. Raised in Austin, Texas, Dr. Chavez received an MA and PhD in political science from Stanford University, and as I mentioned, while she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, she was on a panel with the agregados. I keep forgetting that word in English.
Attaché.
The attachés.
Not in English.
In English. The military attachés, when we had a very interesting discussion about the relationship. So thank you, Rebecca, for being with us. Next, we'll hear from Gerardo Rodriguez Sanchez Lara. Thank you for coming. Gerardo is a professor and researcher at the Department of International Relations and Political Science at the University of the Americas, Puebla, in Mexico. He's also a co-author of the Global Impunity Index and Mexico's Impunity Index. Gerardo is a postgraduate professor of the main civilian and military academies in Mexico and is a member of the Colectivo de Seguridad con Democracia. And he just handed me a book that he published last year called Seguridad Nacional en Mexico, National Security in Mexico y sus problemas estructurales, its structural challenges, let's call it. So we are delighted to have Gerardo here to provide sort of the Mexican view on this relationship as well. And last but not least, our good friend and collaborator, Inigo Guevara. Inigo Guevara is director at Janes Aerospace, Defense, and Security. He's responsible for supporting the growth and expansion of the aerospace and defense consulting practice in the Americas. Inigo is a subject matter expert in Latin American armed forces, focusing specifically on the Mexican military, including arms trade trends, defense industry developments, and procurement policies. And as I mentioned, we're launching today his paper called More Than Neighbors, New Developments in the Institutional Strengthening of Mexico's Armed Forces in the Context of U.S. Mexican Military Cooperation. And he has been a long-term collaborator with the Mexico Institute. So thank you also, Inigo. So with that, let's get started here. Craig, you have the floor. You're welcome to come up here. We'll put up your presentation. You're welcome to do it from there or over here. You gonna do it there?
Sure.
Okay. Let me just recommend that Rebecca and Inigo just push aside a little bit because for better viewing. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Hey, good morning. Is this on?
Yeah,
Hello, hello.
we're good.
Buenos dias. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the opportunity. We are on the record, yes?
Yes, we are on.
Can never be too sure about this. Oh, and look, yes,
We're even webcasting this.
a shameless plug for this book. I can safely say that it's the best book-length treatment of this topic because it's the only book-length treatment of this topic. I could just look at that for the rest of the day, but please, let's, next slide. It is you could be one of the first 10 to own it if you go to Amazon. It's like that.
First 10?
20. Yeah. So, where to start? I guess I'm a living fossil because I was there when this relationship started to change. I was a young attaché. Well, so not then.
That's Santana.
Not then. Here's post-Cold War. I was there. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so when we think about the U.S. Mexico defense relationship, I show those previous slides to underscore that that we start. The relationship begins from a period of a lack of trust, shall we say? For those of you who don't recognize the painting, that's the Battle of Chapultepec, September of 1847. Next slide. And of course, after that, we have a period in which the young nation of Mexico is struggling, perhaps not unlike today, between conservative and liberal values. Next slide. And even during their revolution, we managed, the neighbor to the north, managed to be involved. La Decena Trágica and other sorts of things. Next slide. To include, toward the end, well, actually in the middle of the revolution, the gent to the left is Rear Admiral Mayo, the commander of the naval U.S. forces outside of Veracruz and Tampico when we have the unfortunate incident in 1914. And of course, the gent to the right, then Brigadier General Blackjack Pershing looking for Pancho in 17. So it wasn't just an isolated incident. And I wrote the book because I happened to grow up in Mexico. I did high school there. And when I talk to my American friends and they say, well, why sometimes don't Mexicans like us? And I said, well, you got an hour? Sit down. I'll tell you a story or two. So we go beyond all that, and suffice to say that the relationship had been cordial but distant. Alan Riding's Distant Neighbors sort of captures that nicely. And of course, coming out of the Reagan administration, where the relationship had not been terribly wonderful at senior levels, the defense-to-defense relationship was similarly distant. But that all begins to change in the late 80s, early 90s, and the role of the leadership of these two gentlemen was essential. Next slide. They're drinking the forthcoming NAFTA agreement. I use this slide to reinforce the notion that there was some political cost, domestic political cost to Carlos Salinas when he was trying to move this forward, he understood that he needed to hitch Mexico's wagon to a locomotive of growth. China wasn't an option then, maybe now. And so he looked north, but he at some cost. Does anybody recognize the, I mean, I know certain people do, but for those who don't, that's Diana the Huntress, La Cazadora Diana. And I show the picture because back in the day, as he was undergoing this challenge, they said, what do Diana the Huntress and Carlos Salinas have in common? Does anybody know the answer? I know some people do. And it's because los dos están dando las nalgas para el norte. And if you don't understand what I said, ask one of your neighbors. He did. So again, there was a challenge. Next slide. So in the midst of all that, we have for the first time a U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Gordon Sullivan, who in 1992 was the first in that position to ever visit Mexico. You know, we've been neighbors for a couple hundred years. The Mexican Army in its current configuration since 1917, a U.S. Army Chief of Staff had never visited. Kind of amazing. And when I interviewed him years later, why did you do that? Especially, another minor anecdote, when he was briefed as to his visits to Latin America, he's going to visit with Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he sees the briefer the next day and he goes, "Hey, Bob, I noticed that Mexico wasn't on that list." He goes, yes, sir, Mexico, it's just too hard. You know, they're prickly. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. He goes, "Okay, great, I'm going." And he decides to go. And when I ask him, well, why did you go? He's got this great Boston accent. He goes, "Christ, they're our neighbor. Like, of course I'm going to go. Why would I not go?" And yet no one else had ever done that. And a little known story is that in 2 years, between 92 and 94, General Sullivan visited Mexico not once, not twice, but 3 times before and after Los Zapatistas. And his counterpart visited the U.S. not once, not twice, but 3 times. 6 mutual visits in the course of 2 years. Hasn't happened before, hasn't happened since. And all kinds of stories that I could go into. But what I'm emphasizing here is the leadership, the decision to do this is what started to change. Again, pre-NAFTA signing. Sullivan says, well, you know, we're moving in the direction of NAFTA. Of course I'm going to go visit. Next slide. Oh, go back one. Can you go back? Okay, next one. I'm sorry. So this next slide is taken from the reviewing stand at Campo Militar Número 1, and it's a parade in honor of visiting Secretary of Defense William J. Perry in October of '95, the first visit by a sitting U.S. Defense Secretary. And after this, he goes in, and he goes extemporaneous because he said, "I've just witnessed the most spectacular display of military professionalism I think I've ever seen. You haven't lived if you haven't seen a company of Mexican Army nurses all in white, double timing past the reviewing stand. It's spectacular." Next slide. And so Secretary of Defense Perry and General Enrique Cervantes begin to establish this very positive relationship. The dashing young man to the right wearing the all-American patch is, again, the living fossil. I showed up in the office 2 weeks before Perry visits. Talk about just good timing and blind luck. And it's difficult to explain the quality of the rapport that the two, and neither one of them spoke the other's language. So either Gerardo Woolberg, the Mexican major, now Brigadier General, I believe, or is he? Whose English is better than mine, and won't say about how good his Spanish is. We were always there doing that, and there's just a wonderful relationship. And that, too, is a decision. The State Department recommended against it, and in fact, he demurred. He didn't go on the first time he planned to. But when General Cervantes went to General Sullivan's retirement based on what General Viridiana had said before, and he invited him, he accepted. And I have a hypothesis, and that is, it wasn't a random invitation, and he either was told by President Cedillo or asked permission to the president to extend the invitation. And it was another example of how, again, what's the context? NAFTA sign, Zapatistas, peso crisis, Clinton against the will of his Congress provides the loan's repaid. That's all going on. And so as Perez says, this is the, of the three pillars, political, diplomatic, economic, and security. The security was the third pillar of the stool, if you will, that needed to be implemented. And this is where that happens, or begins. Next slide. And of course, we had momentous elections in July of 2000. The Perez chokehold on political power it goes to President Fox and the PAN. And prior to 9/11, there had been 4 visits, state-level visits. This is in San Cristobal de las Casas, of course, between the two presidents. And then, next slide, 9/11 happens and everything changes. Next slide. And because of 9/11, the U.S. for the first time creates a U.S. Northern Command and incorporates, prior to this, there are 3 countries that are unassigned to U.S. Geographic Combatant Command: Mexico, Canada, and the Soviet Union. And so as you create Northern Command, Mexico and Canada fall within the area of responsibility in terms of coordination to the Northern Command commander. But as Secretary Rumsfeld and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Richard Myers, unelegantly explained in this conference in 2002 when they're talking about the establishment of Northern Command, and say the command of Northern Command will be responsible for all operations in North America, Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Next slide. And this gentleman by the name of General Vega Garcia says, au contraire, the only person in charge of operations in Mexico, c'est moi. And as long as, well, okay, so it's in Spanish, right? As long as I'm the Secretary of Defense, there will be no relationship with Northern Command. And there was not. The Navy, which has a very different relationship and has had historically with the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, continued cooperating closely with the U.S., but the Army did not. That's not to say that the relationship was broken. Vega Garcia visited with the Secretary of Defense, with the chairman, but just not with this new entity called Northern Command. Next slide. And that continued throughout his tenure. President Calderon comes to office, and even prior to taking office, he has a meeting in November with President Bush, and Ambassador Tony Wayne could probably confirm this in a different way, but when I interviewed Ambassador Tony Garza about that, President Calderon says, "How do I talk to your president?" He says, "Well, my president's a very direct guy. You talk to him directly." He says, "Yeah, but give me the language." He says, "Well, when he's asking you what you, if you're in, say, yeah, are you in?" And he'll say, "I'm in." And he goes beyond that. After they do that, they say, "Are you in?" "Yes, I'm in." And President Bush asked President-elect Calderon, "So what do you need?" And President Calderon says, "Let me put it this way. If Jack Bauer's got it, I want it." So that's when we see this new phase, and we move beyond what we used to call security assistance to Mexico to security cooperation between the United States and Mexico. And just to put a fine point on it, prior to Secretary Perry's visit in '95, IMET, International Military and Education Training Funds for Mexico, was less than $100,000 a year. Perry made the decision to increase it to 1 million. And so if we go from 1 million in 96, and then other sorts of funds begin to increase, salud, till I think in 2015, the latest data I have, all security cooperation funding is in the neighborhood of $15 million. That's not talking about FMS sales, just training. For a guy like me who grew up in Mexico, or spent time as an attaché, where you had to get approval from the Secretary of Defense for someone to visit your house, to this level of cooperation is truly astonishing. Next slide. And so we have a minor break. Perry retires. That great relationship they had established sort of goes away because General Cervantes doesn't have anybody to talk to. When Cohen comes in, he doesn't visit. Rumsfeld never visits. Fair enough, he's got 2 wars going on, but still, it's right next door. But he never does. But Secretary Gates visits not once, but twice. And at this one, it's the first time there is a combined meeting between the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the Mexican Secretary of Defense, and the Mexican Secretary of the Navy. You can see Admiral Salinas, and right next to him, General Galvan. And so the relationship, again, continues to move forward and strengthen. Next slide. I just like the picture. Next slide. And we have, for the first time in 2012, I believe, the first North American defense ministers meeting, where you have the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Hagel, his counterpart from Canada, is that McKay? And then General Cienfuegos and Admiral Sullivan. Next slide. Another not very well told story is the relationship that General Chuck Jacoby, the commander of Northern Command, establishes with his counterparts. A very quiet, unassuming gentleman who sort of under-promises and over-delivers. He had come on the heels of Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, who went on to be the vice chairman, who had improved relationships from those that had been in place under General Gene Renwart, Air Force 4-star. I won't talk about it, but there's a great little story in the book. Next slide. And so, the so what, right? So what? What do we care? This is the so what. To the extent that we collaborate in terms of intelligence sharing, training, and so forth, we're both more effective. And this is, of course, I think this is technically the 3rd time they actually grabbed Chapo, but who's counting? Next slide. And so that's former Chairman Marty Dempsey with General Cienfuegos and Admiral Soberon at a meeting at actually the National Defense University in the War College's spaces. And another little known fact is there was a term of art called Dempsey's 6, where General Dempsey identified the top 6 countries in terms of priority. I won't mention the other 5. You can guess who they are. But one of those was Mexico. And just amazing, again, in terms of how far we have come in a relatively short period of time from a sort of the Heisman, a distant relationship, to one of exceptionally close coordination. Next slide. And I'll end there, but I can't help myself because Dr. Chavez Bill Chavez will talk about sort of the current state of affairs, but I just have to leave you with this slide to say that things are changing, but the defense-to-defense and the mill-to-mill relationship is holding despite the rhetoric. And I'll stop there, and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Craig. Really appreciate it. The historic context is so important, and I appreciate your summarizing it. Okay, we'll turn now to Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, who will kind of bring us up to today and talk about the most recent experience in the relationship.
Okay, thanks. Good morning. It's really wonderful to be here, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue after we all have our presentations. Craig, thank you so much for setting the stage. I do agree with your thesis that the mill-to-mill relationship is holding, but I don't think we should take it for granted. So I want to preface my comments with that statement. So I've been asked to focus my remarks on the 8 years of the Obama administration and how our defense relationship evolved during that period. And so I'm going to give you my view from my former perch as DASD, Western Hemisphere Affairs, under President Obama. So what I'm going to do first is talk about some of the concrete steps we took to advance our partnership. And then I want to highlight some concrete areas of cooperation. So in essence, what I want to do is talk about the relationship that President Trump inherited, and therefore what's at stake if there is to be a downturn in relations. Because we hear a lot about how the Trump administration's rhetoric and how the policy positions on the wall, on NAFTA and immigration, how they threaten economic, political, and even societal ties. But we don't hear as much about the potential impact on our security cooperation, our defense cooperation, which, as Craig pointed out, is a very important pillar of our broader bilateral relationship. And I do think this challenge is real. Mexico's heading into an election year. Anti-Trump sentiment continues to grow in Mexico, and that increased the political cost of partnering with the U.S. It's a reality. The Americas Barometer in 2017 came out with what I think is a very sobering statistic, that the distrust of the U.S. rose from 31% in Mexico. The distrust of the U.S. rose from 31% to 84% in the 3 months after the election. So we have a lot to lose. And Trump did inherit a relationship, I think, in the defense realm of unprecedented cooperation. So first, how did we get there? As Craig said, we've kind of gone through ebbs and flows. The mill-to-mill relationship has held very steady. But how, over the 8 years of the Obama administration, what did we do? And both the United States and Mexico took steps, and it resulted in a transition of the strategic level defense relationship. And I saw determination on both sides, and will on both sides to strengthen ties. And a lot of this was about confidence-building measures to increase the trust. I mean, Craig mentioned since the very beginning there was this trust deficit. So, and also kind of, you mentioned Secretary Gates' advice that we have to kind of move at the speed of trust, that Mexico should have its foot on the gas pedal. We can't push too hard, too fast. But all of this, these gradual confidence building measures, they ultimately allowed us to really kind of roll up our sleeves and have the difficult and frank back and forth in forums such as the Defense Bilateral Working Group that allowed us to collaborate with Semar and Sedena, senior leadership, to develop long-term objectives, to set priority areas of engagement. And I think one of the major outcomes of this is that we traditionally have had a lot of cooperation in the area of counter-narcotics, but we moved beyond that narrow focus to talk about or to collaborate in when it comes to more traditional defense activities. Former Secretary of Defense Carter in 2016, he highlighted the advances, and in his words, he recognized that Mexico had expanded the traditional role as a regional defense leader and is becoming a global exporter of security across the hemisphere and across the world. And indeed, Mexico has demonstrated both the willingness and the capacity to take on a greater share of global and regional security burdens, not just in the Western Hemisphere. So some of the things that set the stage for this, Mexico launched its National Strategic Development Plan, designating, quote, a Mexico with global responsibilities and facing new global expectations. President Peña Nieto in 2014 announced his this foreign policy shift, and the Mexican military supported this shift. But I do want to point out here that it's worth noting that even before the Peña Nieto administration, Mexico already was an important regional defense leader, which did provide the Mexican defense institutions a very solid foundation on which to build. It's often overlooked that even before the shift, Mexico conducted approximately 40 external activities to support around 25 different partner nations, and this is in the 40 years leading up to the 2014 announcement of the shift. And the Mexican military continued to increase its activity in international fora, developing the groundwork for future external military missions, including contributions to United Nations peacekeeping operations. So now I want to talk about the specifics, what we were actually doing together, and therefore what we have to lose. And this gets to the so what question that you mentioned, Craig. And here I just want to say that it's the counter-narcotics, the Chapo example, these are very important, but our defense cooperation goes far beyond sort of the internal security. And we worked very closely with our counterparts in Mexico to develop shared objectives, and we basically placed them, new shared objectives, in two bins. One is regional security, and in this bin we have Central America working together to help the troubled nations, particularly of the Northern Triangle, and also the Inter-American Defense System. So that's one bin. The second bin is global responsibility. And again, this term is taken right out of the National Development Plan, Mexico's National Development Plan. And this is peacekeeping, and it's also humanitarian assistance and disaster relief coordination, cooperation. So I just want to go through these very quickly, and we can talk about them more in the Q&A if you're interested. So Central America. And I want to point out that our collaboration in Central America is very important to one of President Trump's priorities, stemming the flow of undocumented immigrants. And I think everyone in this audience knows that most of the migration into the United States is not actually from Mexico. It's from the Northern Triangle, from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And this is going to continue as long as those countries face the triple threat of poverty and inequality, weak government institutions, and massive public insecurity. So Mexico and the U.S., we started talking together about how we could address some of the root causes of migration in Central America. This included steps we could take to strengthen defense institutions in the Northern Triangle, increase military effectiveness, transparency and accountability of the defense ministries in this region. And this is especially important in Central America, where you have the military insertion into law enforcement. I mean, you mentioned this, Eric, when you talked about the internal security law in Mexico. It's a big issue in the Northern Triangle. I think a concrete example of Mexico's role is in April 2017, Mexico co-hosted the Central America CENSEC, the Central America Security Conference, co-hosted it with U.S. Southcom and U.S. Northcom. And Mexico really took on a leadership role in this conference. They actually set the agenda. It was a really robust agenda. I think arguably more robust than past CENSECs, and I think this large part this was due to Mexico's leadership. Mexico also helps us with the dirty work of apprehensions. The 2014 unaccompanied children crisis would have been much worse without Mexico's assistance along the major smuggling routes. The Migration Policy Institute reports that Mexico is responsible for over 40% of apprehensions of those who are bound for the United States. So even with Mexico's help, we see that this is continuing. The flow continues, which underscores the need to focus on the roots of the problem rather than the symptom. Again, turning to the Americas Barometer in 2017, the Americas Barometer reported that over half of those living in the Northern Triangle fear being victim of a homicide. And this very staggering statistics, I think it helps explain why the intention to migrate to the United States continues and why continued cooperation with Mexico is critical. And actually not just cooperation with Mexico, but cooperation with the entire community of Western Hemisphere nations. Second thing in this regional security bin is the Inter-American Defense System. So like our efforts in Central America, Mexico and the United States, we have a shared interest in strengthening the Inter-American Defense System. And this has provided opportunities for collaboration, to build mutual confidence, and to grow our defense partnership. And Mexico has really, really stepped up here. Mexico hosted the 2014 North American Defense Ministerial. The picture of Secretary Hagel, that was from that NATOM in Mexico City. Mexico is going to be hosting next year's Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, which is also a very important conference, a very big deal for Mexico. Mexico has increased its presence in the Inter-American Defense Board from zero permanent staff in 2014 to about 20. And as Eric mentioned at the outset, Mexico is now the president, holds the presidency of the Inter-American Defense Board, and we're lucky to have the General Rodriguez Bucio here with us today. So that's, I'm going to stop there with the idea, so I'm running out of time, but so I want to turn now to the global responsibility bin. And here I want to highlight our nascent cooperation in humanitarian assistance, disaster response. And the importance of this cooperation has been highlighted by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And these environmental calamities represent another real challenge to stability and security in our region. And it's more urgent than ever as a result of climate change. The Mexican military is a leader when it comes to expertise and in the provision of technical assistance and know-how in disaster relief. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Mexican soldiers provided potable water, hundreds of thousands of meals, and hundreds of medical consultations along our Gulf Coast. Before the Mexico City was hit by the 7.1 magnitude earthquake in September, Mexico was poised to provide important logistical support in Houston after Harvey. And as host of the 2018 Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, Mexico is working closely with countries like Chile, Canada, and Trinidad and Tobago to develop a hemisphere-wide disaster relief policy. And the U.S., I think it's very important that we're a part of that effort. I do want to say a few words about counter-narcotics. I stress that we've broadened the aperture of our defense cooperation beyond counter-narcotics, but it remains very important. And it's particularly if we think about the Trump administration's rhetoric and policy positions, I think they're particularly puzzling because as with our migration cooperation, in jeopardizing counter-narcotics collaboration, President Trump risks cutting off his nose to spite his face. This is a policy priority for Trump. He's declared the opioid epidemic a public health emergency, and the approach, the U.S. supply-side approach, requires Mexican assistance and collaboration. Over 90% of the heroin in the U.S. is either produced in or shipped through Mexico. Mexico is an important transit point for fentanyl, and it's the principal transit point for the cocaine entering the U.S. In Mexico, it's the military that has the drug enforcement mission, which includes fighting cartels and poppy eradication. So Mexico is a critical partner when it comes to the struggle against illicit trafficking. Craig, at the onset, talked about our shared history as something that we have to overcome, and an important factor to consider as we continue to mature our defense relationship. And the language coming out of the White House does not help when it comes to overcoming that history. I think it exacerbates a lot of the historical problems we've had. So my bottom line is, although the mill-to-mill relationship is held, as has been pointed out earlier, a deterioration in our defense cooperation, it threatens stability and security of our hemisphere in areas from illicit trafficking to migration and natural disaster-related humanitarian crises to destabilizing crime and violence. So I very much hope that Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson continue their outreach, but I would imagine that it sends a very confusing message to our partners in Mexico when you have messages at the level of a secretary sounding very different from the language that's coming from the president. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for reminding us of the various levels and kinds of cooperation beyond simply establishing a relationship that's important, and what's potentially at risk here as we go forward. We appreciate that. Let's turn now to Gerardo Rodriguez Sanchez Lara from the University of the Americas in Puebla.
Thank you. Thanks to the Mexico Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation. It's an honor to be with Inigo Guevara. I think that he is the most important Mexican expert on Mexico's army institution here at DC. He is a hard power Mexican expert at Washington and also a colleague at the Heraldo de Mexico. They're Craig, the non-historian, most important expert on U.S. Mexico relations. Rebecca Bill, by far you are the most brilliant star of this panel, and we all recognize you, the historical responsibility you have at the DOD. So, and Eric also, I really appreciate the invitation. I make a small presentation, but that's my university, gorgeous at Puebla. Next one. Next one. Yeah, okay. So what we are seeing, maybe it's a change on Mexico's military doctrine. Maybe in like 10 years, apart from this moment, Craig can write about some change in the military doctrine. There's a lot more of internal security work in Mexico by the military police. That's the force that is right now helping the civilian forces, and also the international security. This image, I would like to saw it maybe 15 years ago when the IT crisis went into the desk of General Gerardo Clemente Garcia Vega and President Fox, and they didn't ask and they didn't respond for the asking for resources and Mexican UN peacekeeping operation to IT, to MINUSTA. Next. Well, in terms of the future of Mexico, Mexico is going to be the 7th economic power by 2050. It's a forecast by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Here's not Duncan, but my colleagues also from the Canadian Institute, but Canada is going to be the 17th power, while Mexico is going to be the 7th economic power in 2050. And to be an economic power makes their responsibilities to be grown. Next one, please. Here is the national security budget evolution. We can see in the, we cannot see it clearly, but here is, I'm going to stand up. This is the increasing budget. So as you can see, from 2007 and 2014, the percentage of the increase of the military budget has been increasing vis-a-vis the other national security institutions. Next one. Well, we all know, and maybe in the book of Viridiana and Duncan and David, they can show these kind of problems. These are the structural problems of security in Mexico. Security system, judicial system, political impunity pact, the inequality and social economic vulnerabilities, and a relatively weak civil society on these matters of national security. Next one. This information was recently released by the National Police, and it is terrible. There's a 50% less capabilities of the local police forces that we need in Mexico. The local police that are within the governor's orders. Next one. So, we're here to talk about defense policies and U.S. Mexico relations. So imagine the relations that our Mexican military institutions have to deal with the Mexican security actors. We have dysfunctional actors at the security level, governors, and also at the federal government. There's also a black box inside the judicial branch. Until 3 years ago, we know that we have only 3.5 judges per 100,000 people. The average globally at our impunity index is 17. So Mexico has to make a great effort also in the judicial branch. The gangbang, the governors. This is the sexennium of the governors in jail. And also the kingpins, the organized crime, and what it is, I think it is the most important issue of this debate on the Internal Security Act debate is that we have the new kids on the block. The civil society in Mexico has, here is Maria Clara Costa, but in national security matters, there's a week of civil society actionism. Next one. Okay, so all these structural problems give us this bad image. Mexico is one of the 5th most impunity countries in the world. This is the global impunity index that we make it possible at the university. Next one. Next one. So, and this is one of the questions I was asked by Inigo before coming from Mexico City. And this is what I see is the silent transformation of Mexican military institution. At the domestic changes, we see the developing of the internal security concept, one concept that is being exported to Latin America, unfortunately. Strengthening the Army and Navy intelligence capabilities. As a professor at CESNAP and COLDEF and CEFA, I'm seeing an incredible evolution of the intelligence capabilities of our Mexican military institutions. And also what we have seen in the last years is that the Army and the Navy has been building an interdependency with some local governments because of their lack of commitment with the security issues. Bilateral U.S. Mexico. Mexico wants to be part of North American security agenda, no more a regional defense free rider. I was a student in a conference with professor of MIT, Michael Sapolsky, and he didn't know that he has a Mexican student right there. And Mike Sapolsky told Mexico is a free rider of the defense strategy of the United States since the Cold War. Yes, for sure. But right now, Mexico is no more a free rider. It's a strategic ally against terrorism and future threats, as also Rebecca reminded us. And it's also a consumer of U.S. Armament. It is really important. 2 years ago, and Inigo has the data, Mexico is buying helicopters, Mexico is buying missiles. It has been a great debate, but Mexico is a net consumer of U.S. armament. At the hemispheric issues, committed to be a leader on the defense hemispheric agenda, and also a global agenda leader. We have the first blue helmet from Mexico in Haiti, the Sahara, and Lebanon. And also we're participating in the special political mission in Colombia. Next. So I was also asked to have some remarks on the Internal Security Act. First, we have to remember that this was a political objective of the military institutions in order to achieve 2 points. Obtain resources from the public security budget, military police, to increase the actual state of force of 10,000 up to 50,000. Like, I think like in 3 to 4 years, maybe if the budget continues to be increased, maybe the military will have this state of force. Yes. We have a problem. Right now, Mexico has a pro-human rights constitution, and we have some clearly problems with the act in terms of transparency, use of force, and problems with our administrative law. Generals Cienfuegos and Sedena and the Navy make a political capitalization. It was a political motivation, and also they invest their personal and institutional political capital on the debate of the Internal Security Act. One really problem. Here in the U.S., in Washington, you have checks and balances. In Mexico, the national security institutions, they don't have a check and balance and no real accountability powers. We have also problems with the local governments, and also on internal security operations, there will be military command versus civilian command. That's something on the debate. Next one. My final remarks, Eric, I'm finishing. We are observing an unprecedented debate about the role of the armed forces in the interior. The armed forces are assuming a role as one of the political actors in the Mexican system. Traditionally, we saw the Mexican army and the Navy be a part of the political activity, the political debate. No more. Mexico is a democracy, and the Mexican military institutions have to be part of this debate. The Mexican army, yes, is polarizing public opinion around its public role and among the political elite. The army and the Navy support the internal security law, not only for legal support in their actions, but to increase their state of force and to strengthen their actions in intelligence matters. The armed forces will continue to support security matters due to the inability of local security institutions. That's a reality. And Mexico is in a security trap, as John Bailey told us 5 years ago, for the next 20 years. And here are two scenarios, two political scenarios. They are in the minds of Washington, DOD, the Eisenhower building, here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. What's going to pass if the Andrés Manuel López Obrador or the other opposition parties won the election about the U.S. Mexico relations on military issues? If an opposition candidate wins July's presidential election, they will win with a middle thirds of the vote. So will desperately need the support of the military establishment, so no change expected on internal security. And finally, the international agenda. I see if López Obrador wins, maybe the new international activism will decrease, as well as military purchase to the U.S. Thanks, Eric, Inigo, for the invitation.
Thank you. Appreciate that perspective from Mexico's side, and focusing on kind of also the changing role of the military within Mexico, which has been changing for some time, but it's important to be reminded of those dimensions. So thank you. Let's turn last but not least to what Gerardo called the #1 expert, Mexican expert on security relations in the United States.
Thank you.
I realized. Thank you for your work on this issue.
Eric, thank you so much. I realize that now I need to write a lot of checks. Okay, so thank you, Eric, for this opportunity, and thank you, dear friends and experts, for coming together for this panel. I think it's shaping up quite nicely. Also like to thank Duncan Wood from the Mexico Institute, if he makes it out of the very cold north. Okay, so let's dive in. The Mexican Armed Forces' recent institutional developments and how the type of challenges that they're facing. So back in 2014, President Peña Nieto gave a speech at the UN in which he talked about, which he declared how Mexico will begin to support international peacekeeping operations. That was a turning point, a significant turning point for Mexico's foreign policy. And it was also a turning point for Mexico's military, because after 70 years of having mostly an internal focus, the Mexican armed forces are now suddenly tasked with developing an external footprint. So at that point, both Sedena and Semar set off to develop sort of a diplomatic infrastructure to increase their defense diplomacy activities abroad. And these have two shapes. One of the shapes are bilateral relations between Mexico and its most important partners, with its most important partner being the United States. I make a similarity between trade and defense cooperation, right? Even though the policy may be to have bilateral defense cooperation activities with most of the countries in the world, with most of the international community, the defense relationship from the U.S. Pulls it basically like a planet, like gravity, right? So we can expect that 80% or so, pretty much like the trade, like international trade does, of international defense cooperation to happen with the United States. So on that note, we have two very busy defense attachés in Washington, D.C., that have, over the past couple of years, been developing a series of relationships of connection points with the U.S. military at multiple connections. So on that end, that is something positive, because if you want to engage with another military, the U.S. military is probably the best established mindset-wise to connect with. It's probably the best force in the world that is predisposed to connect with other militaries. So this plug and play scenario really comes into place. So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect is that Mexico's military foreign policy, if we could call it that, is also struggling to maintain some sense of multilateralism, pretty much as with Mexico's foreign policy, which is very focused on multilateral agenda. The Mexican military shadows this and continues to do exactly the same. So we have Mexico taking up very important positions. General Luis Rodriguez Bucio, present with us today, became the president of the Inter-American Defense Board, which is the longest standing multilateral military organization in the world, I believe, or at least in the Western Hemisphere. So we see that. So in this Mexican military outreach to the international community in multilateral organizations, we see that a lot of them are either U.S. based or U.S. supported. So that's also something interesting to consider, how Mexico takes up a key role as a pretty good functioning partner with the United States. And I stopped right there when I said partner, because I think that I'm trying to find the exact. We don't have an alliance per se, but I'd have to say more than neighbors, more than partners, definitely. So that's one part of the international development. The other part is that Mexico needs to develop a credible power projection capability in order to support its international outreach operations. So whether that be to send peacekeepers and to send peacekeepers beyond the observer status, because up to now, Mexico has contributed around 80 military personnel to different missions around the globe. Gerardo mentioned Haiti, Western Sahara, Lebanon, as well as the operation in Colombia. However, the Mexican military now is in the process of creating the first joint training center, which will be a peacekeeping center, training center in Mexico, which should be able to pump out a battalion-sized unit to begin to contributing with actual force to peacekeeping operations from around 2020. So that's definitely one part of it. And besides peacekeeping, the Mexican military is now faced with the need to invest quite significantly to develop its long neglected and in some cases inexistent conventional military capabilities. So for the past, having spent most of the past 70 years focused on internal security, the Mexican military is mostly a light infantry force on the ground and a Coast Guard type of capabilities at sea. So at this point, Mexico does need to begin to modernize and in some cases create other capabilities, which in the majority of countries around the world are not a big issue, right? Last month, when the announcement that Mexico had procured 6 anti-ship missiles to arm one of its frigates, it suddenly became a crisis in Mexico's media. Oh my God, why is Mexico buying missiles? Well, it was frankly only buying 6 missiles to equip a frigate, which is scheduled to be launched in 2020. And the amount expended on it was, frankly, for us that deal with defense trade, quite insignificant. However, going ahead, Mexico will need to develop a strategic airlift capability to support its forces abroad. They will need to also modernize its combat capability, even if it's just a minor token conventional capability, such as a fighter aircraft capability, armor, and artillery, which are, frankly, I don't think that the word obsolete comes into there fairly. In most cases, they are actually museum pieces. So there needs to be a lot of investment there. What we have seen in the past couple of years is that Mexico evolved from being a military aid recipient to becoming a paying customer. So that is also significant. While defense spending has increased in nominal terms, and here I'll have a minor disagreement with my friend Gerardo, even though you spoke so highly of me. The way that we compare defense spending around the globe is creating an index based on the country's GDP, right? So global GDP, global defense expenditure in GDP is about 2%. For the U.S., that's about 3.4% of its GDP. In Latin America, the average is about 1.2%. So most Latin American countries spend around 1.2% of their GDP on defense, and most Latin American countries have a separate internal security force, which usually reports to a Ministry of Interior, with its armed forces focusing on purely defense matters. However, in the case of Mexico, and this we can trace back to the 1960s, defense spending has not gone over 0.6%. So in a couple of years, we've seen it spike up to 0.7%. But in general terms, Mexico devotes a very poor amount of funding for its military forces. Thank you. So that is basically wrapping on Mexico's external capabilities. If it is to invest, the amount of funding to get it to about 1%, the economic there could definitely be some positive economic outcome out of it if Mexico decides to employ a modern style of procurement. I'm going to go just 1 minute more. I'm going to talk about the internal security forces briefly, with a deficit of Mexican police, which is about 300,000. Mexico needs about an additional 300,000 police at the municipal, state, and federal level. And here we're just talking numbers. We're not even talking quality. The military's role, which was a subsidiary one, and which was to be a temporary support, has now longed for over 12 years, to the point that the Mexican military sees that there hasn't been any advances, any real advances in the police sector. Besides the federal police having increased, last 6 years have been stagnated. The state police, we saw the point at which they were. So the Mexican army is setting up the military police, and the military police is being regular troops that are being retrained in human rights, in legal, the standard legal processes, due processes, etc. We can go into it. You should definitely go into it in the paper. At the same point that the Mexican Navy is setting up a Coast Guard. It's setting up a Coast Guard, and it's now become the national maritime authority, which means that the Mexican Navy is in control of Mexico's 119 ports. This is the same model that the U.S. Coast Guard uses in the States and that multiple countries use around the world. So we can see how internal security is, frankly, has a very direct effect on U.S. national security. So maintaining this military-to-military relationship is, frankly, in the best interest of both countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inigo. And yes, let me just again commend to you Inigo's paper that delves into some of the issues he's highlighted here, building a blue water capacity within the Navy, force projection capacity going forward, and also this issue of the development of the military police. I think it's very significant development. Craig, you started us off. So you've been very patient listening to everybody. I want to give you a chance to respond in any way. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I just wanted to give you that chance, and then I'm going to open it up to questions here from the audience. So,
Just 3 quick points that, if I may.
I could tell you were thinking about some important points.
But so Rebecca mentioned the existence of these bilateral working groups. Secretary Perry had this model in his mind. He had started with the Partners for Peace in Europe, but he implemented the first Latin American bilateral working group in 1995, and it went moribund for a while, but then I believe it was did Frank bring it?
Yep.
Frank Mora, Rebecca's predecessor, brought it back to life. So again, that goes back to Perry's visit. And another thing that Rebecca mentioned that popped in my mind, the impressive continuity that we saw between both administrations. We all are aware that when Bush transferred to Obama, President Obama changed a number of policies around the world. But one of the things he maintained was the security relationship with Mexico. They thought about calling it Merida 2.0 or Beyond Merida, but they didn't. They did change the focus a little bit, but there was great continuity, and perhaps even more impressively was from Calderon back to Peña Nieto, so from PAN to the PRI, and despite an initial yikes, se metieron hasta la cocina, well, these guys are everywhere. After a couple of months, but that collaboration is very helpful, and so that too continued. And then just the final point, you mentioned tweets. My first week in the job, when we were waiting for President Peña Nieto to come the following Tuesday, and then the tweet, well, maybe he shouldn't come if he's not going to pay for the wall, and then the phone call the next day. I had lots of perfectly blonde hair on Thursday, and then Friday I woke up like this. And they canceled. There was a previously established or scheduled meeting between General Cienfuegos and Admiral Soberon to come up and visit with Secretary Mattis, and they canceled that. But the good news is it got back on track, and the cherry on top of the cream, icing on the cake, whatever, is that for the first time, Secretary Mattis went to this year's Independence Day celebrations. He was there for Grito, the first time a U.S. Secretary of Defense has ever been there. So just to reinforce the fact that the defense-to-defense, the mill-to-mill relationship is stronger than it's ever been despite all this. So it's a good news story. We can't be complacent. Couldn't agree more. Thanks.
Let me ask one more question on that, just before we turn it over, and I'll insist on pretty brief responses. But both Rebecca and Craig have mentioned that we can't be complacent, that things could fall, that this could be difficult, especially in the current context of anti-immigrant sentiment and the wall, et cetera, all the things we know. I guess I wanted to ask the Mexicans on the panel, Inigo and Gerardo, the same sort of question. From the Mexican perspective, you're going into a presidential election. Is the same thing possible? Are there risks to the relationship as that campaign goes on and as we see the results? And I'm not asking you to handicap who is going to win the presidency, but could you just say, is this the case on the Mexican side as well?
Well,
You want to pass the hot potato somewhere else, or?
Well, I put it on my presentation, the risk on the relation. I think the huge relation is some kind of structurally interdependence between U.S. and Mexico. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of changes. Maybe Andrés Manuel is going to sell the new presidential airplane. He has also said that he's going to disappear our Secret Service, the Estado Mayor Presidencial. He has also said that he's going to make a National Guard, not the National Guard that you understand here in the U.S. and also in Mexico, kind of coordination between the military and civilian forces. So the Navy and the Army will still continue to be in public security matters. So it is not going to change. What I think is going to change is that maybe they're not going to buy so many helicopters or so many missiles, 6 missiles to the Navy. So I think that purchase have to be done in this last year of President Peña Nieto, because I don't think that Andrés Manuel has the political will to continue that consuming of armament. So I don't think that the relation is on stake because of what people like Rebecca and Craig in your moment, what Steve Bannon told us about the deep state. There's a deep state inside the Department of State and the DOD that are making this relation work day by day. And this, I finish, Eric. We are in the highest level of military cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico ever. So I would like it to continue. I think that the next president will have to take that into account.
Briefly?
Yes, definitely. I just have to say that as long as the rhetoric is one-sided, it gets lost in the noise.
Mm. Rebecca, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to, the importance of Mattis's visit to Grito, I think that was very important. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that it was just as Mattis was landing in Mexico City that the news broke in the Mexican press that coming out of the White House was language that Mexico was similar to Venezuela, that it was, this whole failed narco state language. So you have, yes, you do have a SecDef going to Grito, but you have him arriving at the same time this rhetoric is coming out of D.C., which I think immediately put Secretary Mattis in the very unfortunate position of having to go into damage control. And I would imagine that it kind of hindered his effectiveness.
Great. All right. I'll take 3 questions. Please make them brief so that we have time. There's one all the way in the back there. I'll take one here from Mike and the gentleman here. And I'll come back to you, Evan, if I have an additional time. Please use the mic. We'll start in the back. Identify yourself. Use the mic because people are listening online.
Hi, my name is Kirk Schur with Clearview Strategy Group. My question has both a policy and practical implication. The military has now the Policía Militar with certain functions internally. At the same time, the police have created the Policía Militarizada. Could you talk about that from both a policy and a practical perspective? Because it seems pretty confusing on the ground.
Right. Mike?
Mike Macetic, PBS Online News Hour. There's one contradiction. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. You say there's a fierce internal debate in Mexico about the internal security law, but at the same time, even if AMLO wins, he's not going to change the role of the Army in internal security. If that's the case, what's the purpose of the debate?
Exactly. Thank you.
There we go. There was a question right here with this young gentleman.
Thank you. I'm Andreas Ross with the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I wanted to ask about counter-narcotics. Now, you mentioned or referenced the wall project sort of as the rhetoric that doesn't help the Americans' case. However, is there any middle ground? Is there anything in terms of border security that can be done? There's a number of $25 million at play now, it seems. What are the border security measures that, in terms of counter-narcotics, would actually make a difference?
Hand it to Evan. We'll hold Evan until the next round. So, got 3 questions. I'll let you all pick and choose, and let's try to keep it brief so we can get in another round.
Thank you. For the gentleman in the back, Mr. Kirk, I'm sorry, I haven't heard anything about the Policía Militarizada. So if
You mean like the gendarmerie? Is that what you...
Militarizada? Oh, Policía Militar. Yes, so Policía Militar is this expanded role that the traditional military police has been assigned. The traditional military police in charge of policing the military itself now has a... I'm sorry, no. There's a gendarmerie that was set up, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I'll be glad to look into it if we can talk afterwards. On the internal security debate, why will it be a debate? Thank you. That's it. And sir, on the specific border measures that could take place to significantly improve counter narcotics, I think that the next stage for Mexico's infrastructure development or security infrastructure development will be to set up a radar network in the north of the country. That's been in plan since 2015, has not been yet implemented, but radars in that region would significantly help curb the number of illegal flights coming into Mexico, as well as coming out of Mexico. So that would definitely be something to look into.
Another?
I deeply agree with my friend Inigo, and also I can make a remark. Also, the radar system, and also maybe Mexico has to increase its national security satellites system. So in order to control the production of amapola, cocaine, marijuana, maybe that will be something interesting. I also agree. Andrés Manuel López Obrador has also said that he has not problem with the Internal Security Act, although their party has blocked or tried to block with other political parties, opposition parties, it in the Congress. But I think that Andrés Manuel is going to continue to use the military, and not necessarily with a declaration of internal security.
Rebecca?
This probably seems very obvious, but I think that the internal security lie, I mean, I think that as someone looking in and looking at other countries in the region that have come to rely so heavily on their military for law enforcement, it's just that by passing the law, it takes away any incentive, or the concern that it could take away incentives to strengthen the gendarmerie and the police by institutionalizing this role. So yes, there is the reality that you mentioned. I think both of you actually mentioned the reality is that the police isn't up to this task, but if you have it institutionalized, what is the incentive to actually strengthen the police?
Yeah. I want to hopefully, either Marie Claire or Viridiana Rios or others in other panels will address this point. It's a good question. I would just say that it is it's a profound change in Mexico. Regardless of what Andres Manuel may say or anybody else, it would be akin to changing posse comitatus in this country, to legalize and open up a space. You may, the politicians may all agree, but there would be questions. What is the appropriate role of the military in public security? And that's why it's controversial. Again, people have very different points of view. I'm sure Marie Claire has a terrific explanation here. I'll call on her and Evan and Dolia, and then I'm sorry I'm going to have to close it down because we want to leave space. So, Evan, go ahead. Evan Ellis.
Yes. Evan Ellis at U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. First of all, thank you. Excellent panel, all four of our experts here. So many questions, but if I'll abuse my privilege just for our American colleagues and North American colleagues on the panel.
We're all North American.
We're all North American. I'm sorry.
We're all North American.
Come on, Evan, man, get your head.
Our U.S. colleagues, what in your non-governmental opinion, should be the U.S. role towards the new internal security law? This has been a very important policy consideration in terms of our attitude towards many of our partner nations in the region of how do we engage with military in the internal security role? What should that be? And then for Inigo, particularly, and actually both of our Mexican colleagues, there's been any comments, if possible, on the status of a few of these new important activities, the transition taking over port security from SCT. What is the status of the gendarme, which seems to have been ambiguous in the way it's being implemented, and if any information about the work of Susten in creating these new systems of integration, both on the Marina side and the Salinas side. Thank you very much.
Would you pass the mic to Maria Clara right in front of you? In front of you? Sorry, just.
Thank you.
Maria Clara Costa, who will be our keynote speaker in a minute, but go ahead.
Okay.
I know this is an issue you're interested in.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to ask a question. Aside from everything that has been said about the impact of the internal security law, I think that there is a consensus in Mexico, at least civil society, that an internal security law was needed. I mean, it's obvious that you cannot have military providing internal security without a legal framework or an adequate legal framework. But my question is, why does it go so directly against the Constitution in certain aspects? The National Human Rights Commission has challenged it on constitutional grounds. It's in the Supreme Court right now. The UN was very worried about it, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. So that's my question. Could it not have been the legal framework that is needed, but why challenge rights that have cost so much to achieve?
Okay, and there was a question right over here with Dolia. She's got the microphone, Dolia. The mic doesn't seem to be on. I don't know.
My name is Zolia Esteves, and I'm a journalist. And my question has to do with something that Maria Clara just mentioned, and is addressed to Rebecca Bill Chavez and to Craig Diehr, and that has to do with the human rights issue with the military. I just wonder, those 8 years that you were with the Obama administration, if the issue of human rights violation by the military, and this has been documented in many episodes, some of them very horrible episodes in Mexico, ever came up. Did it ever, was it ever a concern to go forward in this cooperation, military cooperation that you so eloquently described? I mean, it's like the elephant in the room for many people, particularly in Mexico, and a lot of people here, NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolia. Okay, so some important issues. I can go up and down the line, or somebody can volunteer to go first. Rebecca, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you for those questions. And I as far as, Evan, your question, and I think the three questions are very much linked, and I'll look forward to hearing your perspective as well as the Mexican perspective, as well as Craig's perspective on this. As far as our response to your specific question, Evan, about the U.S. response, I think we should not be silent about it. I think we should express our concern. We're not silent. I mean, this is not an issue that's unique to Mexico. I think for example, when President Obama came up with the Central America strategy, and it came to assistance to the countries of the Northern Triangle, a big impediment, and we were very limited in the assistance we could provide because of the military's role in law enforcement. I mean, it is a concern, and I can't provide the Mexican point of view, but I agree, this notion of a legal framework makes sense, but why this particular version, right? Especially for the reasons that I expressed about the disincentive to strengthen the police. And to your question, yes, human rights weighed heavily on us. It's something that came up, I would say, on a daily basis. And I'm happy to talk to you about this offline. But we can talk about the Leahy process. I think is probably the most tangible way that lens to look at this issue through. I think one important step that we made was in the Leahy remediation process. We Mexico was actually the first case where there was a remediation case, and I think a lot of that had to do with the transparency in that particular case where there were gross violations of human rights by the Mexican military. But why don't we talk about that offline, because it's a very big issue, and it is something that weighed very heavily on us, not just in Mexico, but throughout the entire region.
I don't want to cut anybody off, but Gerardo, do you have anything you want to contribute?
Yeah, for sure. To Marie Claire Acosta PhD question, it was for a PhD thesis. The original redaction of the Internal Security Act, the one presented by a Congressman Cesar Camacho, I have some remarks, some information that it was clearly in touch with the Defense Ministry interests. So I think it was a really tough redaction. It has. I was asked by the National Security Council to make my remarks before it passed to the Senate, and I made 22 recommendations to change to the original redaction that was passed in the Mexican Congress and passed to the Senate. So if we made 20 changes to the National Security Act of 2005, and that act passed unanimously by all political parties. I don't understand why the closed mind of the Mexican government to pass it as it was. Maybe it will, and for me, it's shaming that the Army and the Navy needs a law for the internal security actions, but not this law. Maybe they'll have to make some changes and more time to the reduction. And a final remark, Eric. In Mexico, we have only 26,000 federal police for a country of 120 million people. So what we have to increase is not the military police. Sorry to my friends in the Army and the Navy. What we have to increase is the Mexican national police.
Thank you. Craig, any parting thoughts here?
It's a really tough issue, and the perspective I bring to it is a hypersensitivity of what you say in public, and with our historical concerns of sovereignty. I think one of the things I would be very leery of is giving my counsel in public. I would do so in private, and I would hope that our interagency would meet in private and have those conversations in private. But at the end of the day, Mexico is sovereign to take whatever decisions it wants, and we have to acknowledge that. And if we're not, then here we are again. And even if we're right, sticking our nose into a foreign country's business is something that I'm hypersensitive to. So that's all I'll say.
Inigo?
Thank you. Marie Claire, as to the internal security law, I think that it has some positives. It establishes a framework for the military to go into a state, operate there, and then leave. And it requires local government consent to do that, and a mechanism by which they are requesting. However, I also feel that it has several negatives. And some of those include the lack of transparency, the lack of oversight mechanisms for that. I can understand why they're there, because when we look at who would be providing the oversight, I would not have any confidence in them. That does not mean that a law needs to be written for the people that are in power at this point. And unfortunately, that trumps the rest of the law. Excuse the pump. Excuse the.
Thank you all very much. We're going to shift really quickly into our keynote address. We'll break for coffee afterwards, so hang in there just another 30 minutes or so. Please join me in thanking our panel. Obviously, we just scratched the surface here, but we appreciate all your involvement.